Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left but a choice and whatever's in his pocket. For Elijah Stone, that moment came with $500 and a piece of Montana land everyone said was worthless. The old rancher who sold it warned him plain, "That cave is empty, nothing but wind and bones." But Elijah had learned long ago that what folks dismiss often holds the truest value. So he took his lantern and walked into that darkness. What he found changed everything. There was Confederate gold, old outlaw journals, and strange carvings in the stone. But the real question wasn't what was hidden there. It was why men would kill to keep it buried. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory in the spring of 1876 was a land of hard choices and harder men. Copper Ridge sat in a valley where the mountains pressed close on three sides, as if the peaks themselves were trying to squeeze the life from the town below. It was a mining settlement that had seen better days. The copper veins were playing out, and with them went the hope that had drawn folks west in the first place. Elijah Stone had arrived 3 weeks earlier with a worn saddlebag, a reliable horse named Keeper, and precisely $543 to his name. He was 52 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines in his face that made him look older. His hair had gone mostly gray, but his eyes were still sharp, the kind of eyes that missed nothing, a habit from his years as a Union scout during the war. He'd been a lot of things in his life. A farmer's son in Pennsylvania, a soldier who'd learned to read terrain and track men through country that wanted to kill you. A husband to Sarah for 26 years until a fever took her 2 winters back. After she died, the farm had felt too big and too quiet. He'd sold it, packed what mattered, and pointed Keeper west because west was where a man could disappear into something new. Or so he'd hoped. Copper Ridge wasn't much to look at. Main Street ran north to south, lined with weathered buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired from holding themselves upright. There was a mercantile, a land office, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, and a boarding house run by a widow named Ruth Brennan. The sheriff's office sat at the south end, a squat building with bars on the windows and a sign that needed repainting. The people were guarded. They'd seen too many drifters and schemers roll through chasing rumors of easy money. Elijah understood that. He didn't push himself on anyone, just paid his way, kept his word, and waited for folks to take his measure in their own time. Sheriff Tom Mackey was the first to warm up to him, though warm was a generous word for the man's cautious respect. Mackey was in his mid-40s, with a steel-gray mustache, and the deliberate movements of someone who'd learned not to rush into anything. He'd been a cavalry sergeant before pinning on the badge, and he recognized something familiar in the way Elijah carried himself. "You've got the look of a man who's seen some weather," Mackey had said one afternoon, when Elijah stopped by the office to register his arrival with the town. "I've seen my share," Elijah had replied. That had been enough for Mackey. Not friendship exactly, but the beginning of trust. Ruth Brennan was harder to read. She ran her boarding house with quiet efficiency, a woman in her late 40s who'd buried a husband 5 years back and built a life out of what remained. She had dark hair threaded with silver, pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that assessed everyone who walked through her door. She fed her boarders well, kept the rooms clean, and didn't tolerate nonsense. Elijah had taken a room there when he arrived, paying a week in advance. Ruth had nodded her approval at that and showed him to a small but tidy space on the 2nd floor. "You planning to stay in Copper Ridge long?" she'd asked. "Haven't decided yet," he'd said honestly. "Depends on what I find." She'd studied him for a moment. "You don't have the look of a miner." "No, ma'am." "I'm not." "Good. We've got enough men breaking their backs for rock that's mostly played out." She'd paused at the door. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late." The third person who'd caught Elijah's attention was young Daniel Webb, the clerk at the land office. Daniel was maybe 25, with sandy hair and an eager curiosity that reminded Elijah of himself at that age. The young man had come west for adventure and found himself shuffling papers instead. But he hadn't let that kill his enthusiasm. Daniel knew the history of every property in the county, every claim and deed and survey. He read everything he could get his hands on and asked questions that showed a mind hungry for understanding. It was Daniel who'd first mentioned the Hoskins property. They'd been talking about land prices one afternoon, and Daniel had pulled out a survey map, spreading it across the counter in the land office. "There's a piece about 8 miles north that's been sitting unsold for 2 years, Daniel had said, tapping a spot on the map. "Old man Hoskins has been trying to unload it since his brother died. Nobody wants it. Too rocky for farming, no visible mineral deposits. And there's this cave on it that gives folks an uneasy feeling." Elijah had leaned closer to study the map. "How much land?" 40 acres. "Hoskins is asking $500 for it, which is practically giving it away. Why is he so eager to sell?" Daniel had shrugged. His brother Samuel lived out there in a cabin for almost 10 years. Became a hermit, really. Folks said he got strange toward the end, talking about voices in the cave, ancient secrets, that kind of thing. When Samuel died last year, Hoskins inherited it, but he won't set foot on the property. Says it's cursed. "You believe in curses?" Elijah had asked. "No, sir, but I believe in people's fear of them." That conversation had stayed with Elijah. $500 for 40 acres. It was more land than he'd need, but the price was right, and something about it called to him. Maybe it was the fact that everyone else avoided it. Maybe it was the cave. He'd always been drawn to mysteries. 3 days later, he'd ridden out to see the property for himself. The land was exactly as Daniel had described, rocky, sparse with vegetation, rising into foothills that eventually became mountains. But there was water from a spring, and the bones of Samuel Hoskins' cabin still stood, weathered but salvageable. The view stretched for miles across the valley, and the air smelled clean. And then there was the cave. It opened in the side of a limestone outcropping, a dark mouth about 8 feet high and twice as wide. Standing at the entrance, Elijah had felt a cool breeze flowing out from the darkness, carrying with it a smell of stone and age. He'd stepped just inside, letting his eyes adjust, and seen that the passage continued back into the earth, curving out of sight. He'd brought no lantern that day, so he hadn't gone far. But something about the place felt significant. Not frightening, just important, in a way he couldn't quite name. The next morning he'd returned to the land office and told Daniel he wanted to buy the Hoskins property. Daniel's eyebrows had risen. "You're sure?" "I mean, it's a fair price, but I'm sure." "Can you arrange a meeting with Hoskins?" The meeting had happened 2 days later in the back room of Ruth's boarding house. Hoskins was a gaunt man in his 60s, with hollow cheeks and nervous hands. He'd brought the deed already prepared, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to finally take the land off his hands. "You understand what you're buying?" Hoskins had asked, his voice rough. 40 acres, more or less, with a cabin and a cave, Elijah had said. "That about cover it." Hoskins had stared at him for a long moment. "That cave goes deep. My brother Samuel spent years exploring it. Toward the end, he wouldn't talk about what he found. Just said I should never go in there, and if I ever sold the land, I should tell the buyer the same." He'd leaned forward, his eyes intense. "That cave is empty. You hear me? Nothing but wind and bones. Don't go looking for anything more." The warning had been so earnest, so specific, that it had only increased Elijah's curiosity. But he'd simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." They'd completed the transaction. Elijah had counted out $500 in cash, watching it disappear into Hoskins' trembling hands. The old man had signed the deed over, pressed his seal into the wax, and stood to leave without another word. At the door, he'd paused and looked back. "I hope you're a God-fearing man, Mr. Stone. You're going to need it." Then he was gone. Ruth had been standing in the hallway when Elijah emerged. She'd raised an eyebrow. "So you bought it?" "I did. You know people are going to think you're touched in the head. Let them think what they want." She'd smiled slightly at that. "I suppose a man who's lived as long as you has earned the right to make his own foolish decisions." But there had been something almost approving in her voice. That had been yesterday. Now, standing in the weak dawn light outside his new property, Elijah felt the weight of the decision settle over him. $500 was nearly everything he had left. If this turned out to be a mistake, he'd be starting from scratch again. But as he looked at the cave entrance, dark and waiting, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Whatever was in there, whatever Hoskins' brother had found or feared, Elijah was going to discover it for himself. He hitched Keeper to a stunted pine, pulled his lantern and supplies from the saddlebag, and walked toward the darkness. The cave was waiting. The lantern flame danced as Elijah stepped into the cave, casting shifting shadows across walls that had known darkness far longer than any man's memory. The temperature dropped immediately, that peculiar coolness of deep earth replacing the spring warmth outside. His boots scraped against stone, worn smooth in places, rough in others, telling a story of water and time. The entrance passage ran straight for about 30 feet before bending to the right. Elijah moved slowly, holding the lantern high, studying everything. The walls bore no marks he could see, no initials carved by curious visitors, no smoke stains from torches. Either very few people had ventured this far, or someone had been careful to leave no trace. Around the bend, the passage opened into a chamber perhaps 20 feet across. Here the ceiling rose to twice his height, and the lantern light couldn't quite reach the far corners. But what it did reveal stopped Elijah in his tracks. Someone had lived here. Not recently, but not ancient either. Against one wall stood a crude wooden frame that had once supported canvas or hide, the remnants of a shelter within the shelter. Nearby, a circle of stones marked where fires had burned, the rock still blackened with soot. Rusted metal gleamed dully in the lantern light, tin cups, a dented coffee pot, the remains of a camp stove. Elijah set the lantern down and began a methodical search. The more he found, the clearer the picture became. This had been an outlaw camp, he was certain. The isolation, the hidden location, the evidence of long-term occupation, it all fit. He found ammunition boxes, empty but marked with dates from the 1860s. 3 rifles leaned in a corner, their barrels crusted with rust, their stocks warped and cracked, in a natural alcove, protected from moisture by an overhang of rock. He discovered something more personal, a leather satchel, its straps rotted, but its contents preserved by the dry air of the alcove. Inside were personal effects: a straight razor, a deck of cards, a small Bible with water-stained pages, and a photograph of a woman and child. The image faded to ghostly grey, and beneath these items, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job well, was a journal. Elijah carried it to where his lantern sat and opened it carefully. The leather cover was embossed with initials, JBC. The pages were brittle but legible, covered in a strong, confident hand. He turned to the first entry, April 15, 1864. We have found sanctuary in these mountains. The cave will serve our purposes well, deep enough to hide our operations, remote enough that no law will stumble upon us. Wade believes we can use this as a base for 6 months, perhaps longer. Elijah felt his pulse quicken. He flipped through more pages, reading entries that detailed the daily life of what was clearly an outlaw gang. Raids on supply wagons, disputes over division of spoils, plans for future robberies. And throughout it all, references to someone called Black Jack. The author himself, Elijah realized, from the initials. James Black Jack Cordell. Even Elijah, who'd spent the war years focused on staying alive rather than following outlaw legends, had heard of Black Jack Cordell. The man had been notorious along the frontier, running a gang that specialized in hitting Confederate supply lines during the war, and then, after the war ended, continuing their work as plain thieves and killers. He read deeper into the journal, watching as the entries grew darker. Arguments within the gang, suspicions of betrayal. And then, in an entry from August 1864, something that made Elijah sit up straighter. The shipment is confirmed. Confederate gold, heading north from a sympathizer's cache in Colorado, meant to fund operations in Montana. Wade has the route and timing. If we take this, we can retire. Every man will have enough to disappear and live like kings. But I don't trust the way Wade looks at that gold. I don't trust the way he looks at me." Elijah turned the page. The next several entries detailed the planning and execution of the robbery. They'd hit the shipment in a narrow canyon, killed the guards, and taken everything: crates of gold coins, bars, and jewelry. The journal described the weight of it, the gleaming promise of it. September 3rd, 1864. "The gold is ours. We brought it to the cave, hidden it in the deeper chambers. The men are drunk on success and whiskey tonight. Wade proposed we wait a year before dividing it, let the heat die down. I agreed, but I sleep with my pistol under my hand." Something has changed in Wade's eyes. The entries after that became sporadic, paranoid. Black Jack wrote about hearing sounds in the deeper parts of the cave, about strange echoes and cold drafts from passages they hadn't fully explored. He wrote about the men becoming uneasy, wanting to take their share and leave. And he wrote about Wade Garrison, his lieutenant, growing more secretive, spending hours in the deeper tunnels alone. October 29th, 1864. Wade says there are chambers beyond what we've explored. He's found stairs, carved stairs, he claims, leading down into the mountain. He says the gold should be moved deeper, somewhere safer. I think he plans to move it somewhere only he can find it. I think he plans to kill us all. That was the last dated entry. But on the final page, written in a shaking hand, quite unlike the confident script of earlier entries, was a single paragraph. "They came at me in the dark. Wade and 3 others. I'm bleeding. I crawled here to write this so someone will know. The gold is cursed. Not by God or the devil, but by what lies below. Wade has gone down into the deep places, and he will not come back the same. If you read this, stranger, turn back. Some treasures are not worth—" The sentence ended there, unfinished. A brown stain spread across the bottom of the page. Blood, long dried. Elijah closed the journal and sat in silence, processing what he'd read. Black Jack Goodell had been murdered by his own men over Confederate gold. The gold had been taken deeper into the cave system, and there was something about carved stairs, about chambers below. He stood and raised the lantern, examining the chamber more carefully now. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a fall of loose rock, he saw what he'd missed before. Another passage, narrower than the first, leading deeper into the mountain. He checked his pocket watch. He'd been in the cave for an hour. He had enough lantern oil for several more hours, and plenty of daylight remained outside. The sensible thing would be to return to town, gather better supplies, and come back prepared for a longer exploration. But Elijah had never been ruled entirely by sense, and something about that journal, about the mystery of what had happened to Wade Garrison and the gold, pulled at him. He picked up the lantern and walked toward the narrow passage. The tunnel descended gradually. The floor, sometimes natural stone, sometimes what looked like deliberately placed rocks, a crude path. The air grew cooler still, and his breath began to fog in the lantern light. The walls here were different, smoother, with a texture that didn't seem entirely natural. After perhaps 50 yards, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first. And here Elijah found the proof of Black Jack's words. The floor was littered with bones, human bones, picked clean by time, and whatever small creatures made their home in the darkness. 3 skulls grinned up at him from different corners of the chamber. Scattered among the bones were the remains of clothing, boots, gun belts, and rusted weapons. The gang members who'd betrayed Black Jack, Elijah thought. They'd killed him, taken the gold deeper, and then something had happened to them here. But what? He examined the chamber more carefully, and his breath caught. On the far wall, clearly visible in the lantern light, were carvings. Not the rough scratches of bored men, but deliberate, precise symbols cut deep into the stone. They ran in horizontal lines across the wall, clearly some form of writing or record-keeping, but unlike anything Elijah had seen before. Not English, not Spanish, not any Native American pictographs he'd encountered in his travels. These symbols were geometric, complex, almost mathematical in their precision. Below the carvings, cut in crude letters that contrasted sharply with the precise symbols above. Someone had scratched a message. "Turn back, the watchers below." Fresh fear touched Elijah's spine, cold and sharp. Not fear of ghosts or curses. He'd never been a superstitious man. But fear of the unknown, of stepping into something he didn't understand. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. Someone had lived in this cave system long before Blackjack Cordell. Someone with the knowledge and tools to carve elaborate symbols into solid rock. And Wade Garrison had found evidence of them, perhaps found more than just evidence. Elijah noticed something else. Boot prints in the dust, near the wall of carvings. Fresh ones, or at least fresher than they should be. Someone had been in this chamber recently. Within days, perhaps. He knelt to examine them more closely. The prints led to and from the carvings, as if someone had been studying them. Then they led toward yet another passage, barely visible in the shadows, a darker opening in the chamber's far corner. Elijah stood and checked his lantern oil. Still plenty, but the weight of the darkness pressed against him now, and the sensible part of his mind spoke up louder. He'd found the journal, found evidence of the gang's fate, found mysterious carvings that suggested something far older than he'd expected. That was enough for one day. He took a final look around the chamber, memorizing its layout, then turned back toward the entrance. As he walked through the passages, his mind worked. The journal was proof of the gold's existence. The carvings suggested something historically significant, ancient inhabitants or visitors to this place. Either discovery would be valuable. Together, they were potentially extraordinary, but those fresh boot prints troubled him. Someone else knew about this cave. Someone else was searching. By the time Elijah emerged into the daylight, squinting against the brightness after the cave's darkness, the sun had climbed higher. Keep a knickered greeting, patient as always. Elijah stowed his lantern and pulled out the journal, looking at it in full light. The leather was old but well made. The writing was clear despite the age. This was a genuine historical document, and it was now his. He mounted Keeper and turned toward town, his mind already planning the next steps. He needed better equipment for a thorough exploration. He needed to research who might have been in that cave recently, and he needed to decide who, if anyone, to tell about what he'd found. As he rode, the weight of the journal in his saddlebag felt both promising and ominous. Hoskins had warned him the cave was empty. The old man had lied or been lied to. Either way, Elijah had just stepped into something larger and more complex than a simple land purchase. The question now was how deep it went, both literally and figuratively, and whether he'd live to find out. Elijah spent that evening in his room at Ruth's boarding house. The journal spread before him on the small writing desk, reading every entry by lamplight. He made notes on a separate sheet of paper, documenting dates, names, and the progression of events. The historian in him, the part that had always loved piecing together stories from evidence, was fully engaged now. Blackjack Cordell had led a gang of 7 men. The journal named them all: Wade Garrison, the lieutenant who'd betrayed him; Marcus Tully and James Pike, brothers from Tennessee; a man called simply Dutch, no other name given; Samuel Creed, a former Union deserter; and 2 younger men, Billy Watts and Thomas Gray, barely 20 years old when they'd joined the gang. 7 men had stolen a fortune in Confederate gold. 1 had been murdered. The other 6 had presumably died in that bone-filled chamber, though Elijah couldn't be certain. He'd counted 3 skulls, not 6. The next morning he returned to the cave. This time he brought rope, extra lantern oil, a compass, paper and pencil for mapping, and his old service revolver cleaned and loaded. The gun was a precaution he hoped he wouldn't need, but those fresh boot prints had stayed in his mind through the night. The journey back to the bone chamber was quicker now that he knew the way. He spent an hour there in the cold silence, examining everything more carefully. He sketched the symbol carvings as best he could, though his artistic skills were limited. He searched the bones and found 3 more skulls he'd missed in the darkness, 6 in total. That left 1 gang member unaccounted for, unless Wade Garrison had been the survivor. He found something else too, tucked in a crevice near the warning scratched into the wall. 3 tarnished coins, each about the size of a silver dollar. He picked them up and turned them in the lantern light. They were heavy, unmistakably gold, and stamped with CSA, Confederate States of America. Proof, physical, undeniable proof that Blackjack's journal told the truth. Elijah pocketed the coins and turned his attention to the dark passage in the chamber's corner, the one the boot prints led toward. He stood at its entrance for a long moment, weighing options. Part of him wanted to plunge ahead, to follow this mystery to its conclusion. But the smarter part, the part that had kept him alive through the war and 52 years of living, counseled patience. Instead, he spent the next 2 hours carefully exploring the passages he'd already seen, mapping them, looking for anything he might have missed. In the main entrance chamber, behind the pile of rusted camp equipment, he found a small cache that had escaped his first search, a tobacco tin containing more gold coins, perhaps 20 in total, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was brittle, but he opened it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed enough to show the cave system's layout. The entrance chamber was marked, along with the bone chamber and several passages Elijah hadn't explored yet. And deeper, past what was labeled Old Stairs, someone had drawn a star and written 2 words, the Archive. Elijah stared at that marking for a long time. Archive. That implied something organized, something preserved. Combined with the precise carvings, it suggested this cave system held more than outlaw treasure. He folded the map carefully and added it to his saddlebag, along with the coins and journal. Then he made his way back to the entrance, emerging into afternoon sunshine that felt warm and welcoming after the cave's perpetual chill. The ride back to Copper Ridge gave him time to think. He had evidence of significant historical value, an outlaw's journal, Confederate gold, and mysterious ancient carvings. The smart move would be to document everything and contact the territorial authorities, perhaps even a university. But those boot prints kept nagging at him. Someone else was searching that cave, and they were being secretive about it. Until he knew who and why, bringing in outsiders might be premature. He needed information, and he knew where to start. Daniel Webb was just closing up the land office when Elijah arrived. The young man's face lit up when he saw him. "Mr. Stone, how's the new property treating you?" "Better than expected," Elijah said. "Can I buy you a drink? I have some questions about the land's history." They walked to the nearest saloon, a place called the Silver Strike that catered to the remaining miners and ranch hands. It was quiet at this hour, just a few men playing cards in the corner and the bartender wiping down glasses. Elijah bought 2 beers and led Daniel to a table near the back. "What do you want to know?" Daniel asked, his curiosity evident. Elijah decided on partial truth. "I've been exploring the cave on my property. Found some interesting things. Old camping equipment, signs someone lived there years ago. Made me wonder about the land's history before Hoskins owned it." Daniel leaned forward, immediately engaged. "Well, Hoskins' brother Samuel bought it in 1866, right after the war ended. Before that, it was unclaimed territory, too remote for most settlers, not enough water for grazing. But there are older stories, if you're interested in that sort of thing." "I am." The young man's eyes brightened. "The indigenous peoples in this region have legends about these mountains. They didn't build permanent settlements here, considered the area sacred or possibly forbidden. The stories talk about the old ones, people who lived here long before any known tribes, people who built cities of stone and then vanished. You believe that?" Elijah asked. Daniel shrugged. "I believe that legends often have roots in truth, even if the truth gets exaggerated over time. And I've seen survey maps from the 1840s that mark some unusual features in these mountains. Carved stones, possible structures. Nothing was ever properly investigated." Elijah sipped his beer, considering. "Samuel Hoskins, the man who owned my land before. What do you know about him?" "Odd fellow. Kept to himself mostly, but he'd come into town every few months for supplies. Always had money, which people found strange since he didn't work. Some folks said he was a hermit by choice, others said he'd gone mad." Daniel paused. "Toward the end, the last year before he died, he talked about finding something in the cave. Something important, but he was vague about it, almost like he was afraid to say too much. Did he ever mention anyone else being interested in the property? Daniel frowned, thinking. Actually, yes. There was a man, well-dressed, not from around here, who came to the land office about a year ago asking about properties in that area, specifically about the Hoskins place. I told him it wasn't for sale at the time, that Samuel was still living there. He left his card, asked me to contact him if it ever became available. Elijah felt his instincts sharpen. You still have that card? I might. Let me check tomorrow at the office. I'd appreciate it. Elijah finished his beer. One more thing. The symbols carved into rock. Have you ever seen anything like that around here? Geometric patterns, very precise, not like typical Native American markings. Daniel's expression grew more serious. You found carvings in the cave? I did. The young man was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. There's a collector in Denver, a man named Marcus Trent. He's been buying up artifacts and documents related to pre-Columbian civilizations in North America. There are rumors he's obsessed with proving some theory about advanced ancient cultures. He's paid good money for anything unusual, carved stones, strange tools, old maps. You think he might be interested in my cave? If it has the kind of carvings you're describing, he'd be very interested. Possibly interested enough to... Daniel stopped himself. To what? To do things that aren't quite legal. Daniel finished quietly. Trent's a wealthy man, Mr. Stone. Wealthy men don't always let obstacles like property rights stop them. Elijah absorbed this information. This Trent, does he have people working for him around here? I don't know for certain, but there have been strangers in town lately. 3 men, rough-looking, staying at the boarding house, but not doing any obvious work. They ask questions, but not in a friendly way. A cold certainty settled in Elijah's gut. The boot prints in the cave, the fresh disturbance of dust. Trent's people had already been there, were probably searching it regularly. And now that Elijah owned the property, he was in their way. Daniel, I need you to do something for me. Don't mention this conversation to anyone. If those strangers ask about me or my property, be vague. Can you do that? The young man nodded seriously. Of course. But Mr. Stone, if you found something valuable, then I need to understand what it is before word spreads, Elijah said. And I need to know who I can trust. They parted ways outside the saloon, Daniel heading home and Elijah walking slowly back toward Ruth's boarding house. His mind was working through possibilities, building a picture of the situation he'd stumbled into. Samuel Hoskins had discovered something in the cave, the ancient carvings, possibly more. Word had leaked somehow, reaching Marcus Trent. Trent had sent men to investigate, but the property wasn't for sale while Samuel lived. Then Samuel died. How? Naturally, or was he helped along? And his brother inherited the land. Hoskins the elder, spooked by whatever his brother had found or said, sold the property quickly to the first buyer who came along. Elijah. Elijah stood between Trent and whatever was in that cave. He was so absorbed in thought that he almost didn't notice the 3 men sitting on the porch of the boarding house until he was climbing the steps. They were exactly as Daniel had described, rough-looking, wearing dusty trail clothes, but with good boots and well-maintained gun belts. They watched him approach with the flat, assessing stares of men who made their living with violence. Elijah nodded politely as he passed them. But the biggest of the 3, a man with a scarred face and hands like hammerheads, spoke up. You Stone, the one who bought the Hoskins place? Elijah stopped, keeping his expression neutral. I am. Here, you paid $500 for it. That's a lot of money for worthless rock. It's my money to waste, Elijah said evenly. The man smiled, and it wasn't friendly. Thing is, my employer's interested in that property. He'd be willing to pay you, say, $1,000 for it. Double your money, you walk away with a profit. Not interested in selling, you might want to reconsider. It's a fair offer. I'm sure it is. But I just bought the place. Haven't even properly settled in yet. The second man, leaner with cold blue eyes, leaned forward. My friend here is trying to be polite. Our employer doesn't like hearing no. You understand what I'm saying? Elijah understood perfectly. But he'd faced down worse than hired thugs during the war. And he wasn't about to be bullied on his first week as a property owner. "I understand that you're sitting on a lady's porch, making threats," Elijah said calmly. "And I understand that Sheriff Mackey doesn't care much for that kind of thing in his town. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get to my room." He moved toward the door, and for a moment he thought they might stop him physically. But something in his bearing, the quietness of a man who wasn't afraid, made them hesitate just long enough. He walked inside, closed the door, and heard the third man, who hadn't spoken, mutter something about old fools going to regret that. Ruth was in the dining room, setting tables for supper. She glanced up as Elijah entered, and her eyes flicked toward the window where the men were visible on the porch. "Those three have been staying here 4 days," she said quietly. "They pay on time and don't cause trouble in the house, so I can't refuse them. But I don't like them. They work for someone named Marcus Trent," Elijah said. "Know him?" Ruth's expression darkened. "I know of him. He owns property throughout the territory, including the bank that holds mortgages on half the businesses in town. My late husband borrowed from that bank to expand our store. When he couldn't pay, Trent's men convinced him to sign over the business for pennies on the dollar. 2 weeks later, my husband was found dead in an alley. Sheriff said it was a robbery gone wrong. But you don't believe that. I believe my husband wouldn't have been in that alley unless someone forced him there." She met Elijah's eyes. "Be careful, Mr. Stone. Men like Trent don't make offers. They make statements. If he wants your land, he'll find a way to take it." Elijah nodded slowly. "I appreciate the warning." That night, lying in his narrow bed, Elijah considered his options. He could sell, take the money, and walk away. It would be the safe choice, but safety had never been his primary concern. And something about this mystery, the ancient carvings, the outlaw gold, the secrets hidden in the deep chambers, called to the part of him that had spent a lifetime searching for meaning and purpose. Sarah would have understood. She'd always encouraged his curiosity, his need to know the truth of things. Before she died, she'd made him promise not to let the world turn him cynical, not to stop believing that some things were worth fighting for. He touched the wedding ring he still wore and made his decision. He wasn't selling. He wasn't backing down. He was going to discover what lay hidden in that cave, and he was going to make sure it wasn't stolen or destroyed by men like Marcus Trent, whatever the cost. Morning came with gray skies and the promise of rain. Elijah was up before dawn, packing supplies for another cave exploration. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake the other boarders. But when he descended to the kitchen, he found Ruth already there, brewing coffee. "Heading back out to your property?" she asked, pouring him a cup without being asked. "I am. Those men left before sunrise." "Rode north." Elijah absorbed that information. "North, toward his land." "I appreciate you letting me know." Ruth studied him for a moment. "My husband was a careful man, Mr. Stone, cautious. He thought if he'd just cooperated, kept his head down, everything would work out." She paused. "Being careful didn't save him. Sometimes the only way to deal with wolves is to show them you've got teeth too." Elijah nodded, understanding what she wasn't quite saying. "I'll keep that in mind." He reached the land office just as Daniel was unlocking the door. The young man looked nervous, glancing up and down the street before ushering Elijah inside. "I found that card," Daniel said, pulling it from a drawer. "The man who was asking about the Hoskins property. The card was expensive stock. Embossed lettering, Marcus Trent, Acquisitions and Holdings, Denver, Colorado. He came himself, not just sent representatives?" Elijah asked. "Yes, about 14 months ago. He seemed very interested, very specific about wanting that exact property. When I asked why, he said something about historical research." Daniel lowered his voice. "Mr. Stone, I did some checking in the territorial records last night. Trent has purchased 17 properties in the past 3 years, all in this general area. And here's the strange part, he hasn't developed any of them. No mining operations, no ranching, nothing. It's like he's looking for something specific and hasn't found it yet." Elijah studied the young man. "You've been busy. I'm curious by nature, and I don't like bullies." Daniel pulled out a rolled map, spreading it across the counter. It showed the region around Copper Ridge, with 17 red marks scattered across it. These are Trent's properties. Notice the pattern? Elijah did. They formed a rough arc around the mountains, with the Hoskins property, his property now, roughly at the center. He's been searching the whole area, Elijah said, working his way toward something. Toward your cave, Daniel said. And now he's finally found it, but someone else owns it. Elijah rolled up the map. May I borrow this? Keep it. I made it for you. Daniel hesitated. Mr. Stone, if you're planning to stand up to Trent, you should know what you're facing. He has money, connections, and no apparent conscience. People who get in his way tend to have accidents. So I've heard. But I didn't come west to run from men like him. Daniel smiled slightly. I thought you might say that. In that case, you might want this too. He pulled out another document, a surveyor's map from 1847, yellowed with age. This is one of the original territorial surveys. Look at the area where your cave is located. Elijah studied the map. The surveyor had marked the general location of the cave and made notations in small, cramped handwriting. Large cave system, extensive passages. Local guides refused to enter. Strange markings on walls. Recommend further investigation. See attached report for details. Is there an attached report? Elijah asked. That's the interesting part. The report was supposed to be filed with the territorial office, but it's missing. The surveyor's name was Edmund Whitmore. He filed this map, then disappeared. Never filed another survey, never claimed payment for his work. Just vanished. Elijah felt the familiar prickle of a mystery deepening. And the strange markings he mentioned could be the same ones you found, Daniel finished. Mr. Stone, I think someone has been trying to keep this cave secret for a very long time. And I think Marcus Trent has finally figured out it exists. They talked for another hour, with Daniel sharing everything he'd learned about Trent and the properties. By the time Elijah left, he had a clearer picture of what he was facing and how dangerous it was. But he also had something else, an ally. Daniel had made clear he was willing to help however he could. The ride out to the property took 2 hours. As Elijah approached, he saw what he'd expected, 3 horses tethered near the cave entrance. Trent's men were inside. He dismounted quietly, tethered Keeper out of sight, and approached on foot. He could hear voices echoing from the cave, angry, frustrated voices. I'm telling you, it's got to be here somewhere. The old man's note said the old man was crazy. Maybe there's nothing to find. Trent doesn't pay us to give up. Keep looking. Elijah drew his revolver and stepped into the cave entrance. Gentlemen, you're trespassing. The 3 men spun around, hands dropping to their guns. Elijah had positioned himself with his back to the light, making himself a harder target while keeping them clearly visible. This is private property, he continued calmly. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, the scarred man from the boarding house sneered. Old man, you're making a mistake. The only mistake would be drawing those guns. I was a scout during the war. I've shot men at ranges you couldn't imagine, in conditions you'd call impossible. And I'm still here. Elijah's voice stayed calm, but his gun hand was steady as stone. Leave now, or I ride to town and come back with Sheriff Mackey. Your choice. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the lean man with cold eyes spoke. We're leaving. But this isn't over. I expect not, Elijah said. They walked past him slowly, maintaining eye contact like wolves forced to back down but not submit. After they'd ridden away, Elijah examined the cave. They'd been searching the main chamber, moving rocks, disturbing his earlier investigation. But they hadn't found the passage to the bone chamber, or if they had, they hadn't gone far. He waited an hour to make sure they weren't coming back, then lit his lantern and went deeper. Past the bone chamber, down the dark passage marked by the boot prints. The tunnel descended sharply here, and after about 100 yards, he found what Blackjack's journal had mentioned, stairs. They were carved directly into the living rock, each step precisely measured and shaped. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Whoever had made these had possessed tools and knowledge far beyond what frontier settlers had. The stairs descended into darkness deeper than his lantern could penetrate. Elijah descended carefully, counting steps. At 47, the stairs leveled out into another passage, wider than the natural tunnels above. The walls here were smooth, worked stone, and along them ran those same geometric symbols he'd seen before, but in far greater profusion. They covered every surface, telling some story or recording some history he couldn't read. The passage opened into a chamber that took his breath away. It was perhaps 40 feet across and 20 high, the ceiling carved in a dome that showed evidence of mathematical planning. Around the walls, carved into niches, sat objects, pottery vessels, stone tools, what looked like measuring instruments of some kind. And in the center of the room, on a raised stone platform, sat something wrapped in what had once been fine cloth, but was now mostly rotted away. Elijah approached carefully and pulled back the remains of the cloth. Beneath was a carved stone cylinder, about 2 feet long and 6 inches in diameter, covered entirely in those precise geometric symbols. It was clearly important. The care taken to preserve it said as much. He lifted it carefully. It was heavy, solid stone, but balanced perfectly. And as he turned it, he noticed something. Certain symbols on its surface, aligned with symbols carved into the platform it had rested on. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a key of some kind. A sound from above froze him. Voices distant but growing closer. More than 3 this time. He counted at least 5 distinct voices echoing down the passages. Trent's men had returned with reinforcements. Elijah wrapped the cylinder quickly in his coat, secured it, and looked for another exit. The chamber had 3 other passages leading from it. He chose one at random and moved quickly but quietly, his lantern shielded to show minimal light. Behind him, he heard the voices grow louder as the men found the stairs. They were coming down, and they were armed. Elijah moved through the passage he'd chosen, trying to map it mentally while listening for pursuit. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes ascending, sometimes level. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, he saw grey light ahead. Another entrance, smaller than the main one, hidden in a rocky outcrop on the far side of his property. He emerged into late afternoon drizzle. The rain he'd seen threatening all morning finally arriving. He could hear shouting from inside the cave behind him. They'd reached the chamber and found the cylinder missing. Moving quickly through the rain, Elijah circled wide around the property, retrieved Keeper, and rode hard for Copper Ridge. The cylinder pressed against his chest where he'd secured it under his shirt, solid and strange against his skin. By the time he reached town, full dark had fallen, and the rain had settled into a steady downpour. He went directly to the sheriff's office. Mackie looked up from his desk, taking in Elijah's muddy, wet appearance. "You look like you've had a day. Trent's men were on my property, inside my cave. When I told them to leave, they came back with more men. At least 5 total, possibly more." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Armed? All of them?" Mackie stood, reaching for his hat. "That's trespassing at minimum, possibly intent to do harm. I'll ride out there first thing tomorrow, have a talk with them. I appreciate it. But, Sheriff, there's something you need to understand. That cave isn't just a cave. There's evidence of an ancient civilization down there. Architecture, artifacts, writing systems. It's historically significant, possibly beyond anything found in the territory before." Mackie studied him for a long moment. "You're certain of this?" "I've seen it with my own eyes. And I believe that's what Marcus Trent is after. Not gold, though there's some of that too, but proof of this ancient culture. Why would he care about that?" "I don't know yet. But he's willing to use violence to get it, which means it's valuable somehow." The sheriff sat back down slowly. "This complicates things. If what you're saying is true, this could be territorial business, maybe even federal. We'd need to bring in authorities with more reach than a local sheriff." "I know. But I need time to properly document what's there before anyone else sees it. And I need protection while I do it," Mackie considered. "I can deputize you temporarily, give you legal standing to defend your property, and I'll post a notice that the cave is off limits pending territorial investigation. That should buy you some time. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Marcus Trent doesn't respect legal notices. If he wants what's in that cave, he'll take it, law or no law." Elijah left the sheriff's office with the deputy's badge in his pocket and returned to the boarding house. He smuggled the stone cylinder up to his room, hiding it under the loose floorboard he'd discovered his first week there. That night, he barely slept. His mind kept turning over everything he'd seen, trying to piece together the story. An ancient civilization had built chambers deep in that mountain. The Cordell gang had stumbled onto them while using the cave as a hideout. Samuel Hoskins had discovered them years later and gone mad. Or at least that's what people thought. Maybe he'd just been overwhelmed by the implications, and now Marcus Trent was hunting for the same thing, willing to kill for it. The question that kept Elijah awake was why. What made these ancient chambers worth murder? He had to find out, not just for himself, but because Sarah had always believed some truths were worth protecting, worth fighting for. This felt like one of those truths. The morning of the expedition arrived with clear skies and cold air, perfect weather for what they were attempting. Elijah, Daniel, and Ruth met at the property an hour past dawn, each carrying supplies carefully chosen for the journey ahead. Elijah had his lanterns, rope, the stone cylinder, his revolver, and his maps. Daniel brought notebooks, pencils, measuring tools, and the camera. Ruth carried medical supplies, food, water, and a geologist's hammer her late husband had given her years ago. Before entering the cave, they stood together at the entrance, and Elijah felt compelled to speak. Once we go deep, we're committed. If something happens down there, getting out won't be easy. Anyone wants to change their mind, now's the time. Neither Daniel nor Ruth moved. Then let's find out what the old ones left behind. They descended into the familiar darkness, passing through the chambers Elijah had already mapped. At the bone chamber, they paused while Ruth examined the remains with a professional eye. "These bones show no signs of violence," she said, kneeling beside one of the skulls. "No breaks, no trauma. They died from something internal, poison, disease, or suffocation. Samuel Creed's letter mentioned the air turning cold," Daniel said. "Could be gas exposure. We'll watch for signs," Elijah said. "Dizziness, headaches, difficulty breathing. Anyone feels wrong, we turn back immediately." They continued down the carved stairs, past the chamber where Elijah had found the cylinder, and into the archive chamber. Here they spent an hour documenting everything. Daniel sketching the wall carvings, while Ruth examined the artifacts, noting their construction and materials. "This pottery wasn't made by any tribe I've studied," she said, turning a vessel in her hands. "The technique is more advanced, the decorations more mathematical than artistic. And look at this tool. It's made from a stone that doesn't exist in this region. These people either traded across vast distances or knew how to transport materials we can't imagine." Elijah used the stone cylinder to open passages they'd found sealed. Each chamber revealed more wonders. Astronomical calculations that predicted celestial events with stunning accuracy. Mathematical proofs carved into stone. Medical diagrams showing knowledge of human anatomy that seemed impossible for the era. "When do you think this civilization existed?" Daniel asked, his voice hushed with awe. Ruth studied the layers of stone formation, the mineral deposits, the way time had affected the carvings. "If I had to guess based on the geological evidence, at least 1,000 years before Columbus. Maybe more, maybe much more." They pressed deeper, following passages that descended steadily. The air remained clear and cool, and Elijah watched his companions carefully for signs of distress. But they all seemed fine, just increasingly amazed by what they were finding. The passages began to change. The carvings became denser, more urgent somehow. And in one chamber, they found something new. A carved stone tablet, larger than the others, set prominently on a central pedestal. Daniel approached it carefully, his lantern raised. The symbols here were different. Simpler, as if meant to be read by anyone, not just those who knew the complex writing system. And interspersed with the symbols were pictographs, images that told a story. "I think this is meant to be a warning," Daniel said, studying it. "Look, these images show people entering chambers deep in the earth. And here, they're shown leaving, but something's wrong with them. They're drawn differently, darker somehow." Ruth joined him, examining the tablet. "There's a pattern here, repeated. It looks like a map?" No, more like a diagram showing levels or layers. Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The heart chamber. This tablet is showing the way to it, and warning about what's there. They spent another hour studying the tablet, with Daniel making careful sketches and notes. The message, as best they could interpret, seemed clear. The deepest chambers held great knowledge, but that knowledge came with danger. The ancient builders had sealed something there intentionally and left guardians. Guardians, Ruth said quietly. Samuel Creed's letter mentioned guardians. I thought he meant it metaphorically. Maybe he did, Elijah said. Or maybe the ancient people created some kind of physical barrier or trap to protect what's below. There's only one way to find out, Daniel said. Though his voice carried less enthusiasm than before, they continued deeper. The passages here were narrower, more deliberately constructed, as if designed to limit access. Elijah had to use the stone cylinder 3 times to open sealed doorways, each one requiring a specific alignment of the symbols. Finally, after what felt like hours of descent, they reached a chamber unlike any before. It was circular, perhaps 60 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose 30 feet above them. But what made it extraordinary were the walls. Every inch was covered with carved pictographic records, a complete history of the ancient civilization, as far as they could tell. Images showing the building of cities, the development of agriculture, astronomical observations, mathematical discoveries, and finally, the civilization's decline. This is it, Daniel breathed. This is the chronicle walls, the complete record of their culture. They spread out, each taking a section, documenting as much as they could. The story the walls told was magnificent and tragic. The civilization had thrived for centuries, developing knowledge that rivaled anything in the modern world. But then environmental changes had come, droughts, harsh winters, failing crops. The population had scattered, the cities abandoned. This chamber had been created as a final testament, a message to whoever came after. Ruth found the end of the story, carved in a section near what appeared to be the chamber's main exit, a sealed stone door larger than any they'd seen. "Look at this," she called. This final section, it's addressed directly to future finders. "It's asking something of them," Daniel translated as best he could, his voice halting. "They're asking that their story be told truthfully, that their achievements be remembered, that they not be forgotten or dismissed. And there's a warning. Those who seek to destroy this knowledge, who seek to use it for power rather than understanding, will face the consequences of the guardians." "What guardians?" Elijah asked, examining the sealed door. It had slots for the cylinder, multiple positions that would need to be aligned correctly to open it. "I don't think they mean supernatural guardians," Ruth said thoughtfully. "I think they mean the responsibility itself, the burden of knowing and protecting this knowledge. We become the guardians when we choose to protect rather than exploit." It was a profound thought, and it resonated with Elijah. Sarah would have understood it perfectly, but before they could discuss it further, they heard sounds from above, voices echoing down the passages they descended. Multiple voices growing closer. Trent's men had found them. "How long do we have?" Daniel asked, his face pale in the lantern light. Elijah listened. 10 minutes, maybe 15. "They're not familiar with the passages. They'll move slower than we did." "What do we do?" Ruth asked. Elijah looked at the sealed door, then at his companions. "We have a choice. We can try to get out before they reach us, or we can open this door and see what the ancient builders considered so important that they sealed it away. If we run now, we might not get another chance," Daniel said. "Trent will seal off the cave, bring in his own people. Whatever's behind that door will be lost or destroyed." Ruth touched the carved message on the wall. "They asked that their story be told. They trusted whoever found this to make the right choice." Elijah nodded slowly. "Then we open it quickly." He pulled out the stone cylinder and began working with the door mechanism. It was complex. The cylinder had to be inserted into 5 different slots in a specific sequence, aligned just right. His hands were steady despite the urgency, the old soldier's calm under pressure serving him well. The voices grew louder. Trent's men had reached the archive chamber above. The fourth slot clicked into place. "One more. They're on the stairs," Daniel warned, positioning himself between the entrance passage and where Elijah worked. The fifth slot. Elijah turned the cylinder, feeling ancient mechanisms engage. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound of stone on stone that must have been designed into the system, the great door began to swing inward. A rush of cold air flowed out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it a smell of age and secrets. "Inside," Elijah commanded. "Now!" They grabbed their supplies and slipped through the opening. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of men entering the chronicle wall chamber. Elijah looked back once, seeing lantern lights spilling into the sacred space. Then he pushed the door closed from inside, hearing the mechanisms lock with a finality that gave him both relief and unease. They were sealed in the heart chamber. With Trent's men outside, and no way to know what lay ahead in the darkness, they stood in absolute darkness for a moment. The only sound their own breathing, and the muffled shouts of Trent's men beyond the sealed door. Then Elijah raised his lantern, and the light revealed a chamber that defied everything they thought they understood. It was vast, larger than any natural cave formation should be at this depth. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above their lantern's reach. But what made it extraordinary was what filled the space, row upon row of stone shelves, carved into the walls and standing free throughout the chamber, each holding objects wrapped in preserved materials. "It's a library," Daniel whispered, his voice full of wonder. "An actual library." They moved forward carefully. The objects on the shelves were varied: carved tablets, rolled bundles of the primitive paper they'd seen before, stone tools, astronomical instruments, medical implements, examples of textiles and pottery. Each item was labeled with symbols, organized with a system that spoke of sophisticated, archival knowledge. "This isn't just a record of their civilization," Ruth said, examining a shelf carefully. "This is their accumulated knowledge, everything they learned, preserved for whoever came after." At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, and on it was a single stone, polished smooth, roughly the size and shape of a large book, its surface covered with the now familiar geometric writing. Elijah approached it, while Daniel and Ruth began documenting the shelves. The stone seemed to call to him somehow, and as he read the symbols, not understanding them but feeling their weight, he realized this was the legacy stone Daniel had theorized must exist. The final message from a dying civilization. Behind him, he heard a grinding sound. The great door was being worked on from outside. Trent's men were trying to open it. "How long do we have?" Ruth asked. "Long enough," Elijah said, though he wasn't certain. "Daniel, photograph everything you can. Ruth, gather samples we can carry out. I'll examine this central stone." They worked in focused silence, each aware of the ticking clock. The stone door was thick, but determined men with tools could eventually breach it. The question was whether they'd have time to document enough to prove what they'd found. Elijah studied the legacy stone intensely. Even without understanding the language, certain patterns were clear. The stone was divided into sections, each seemingly addressing different topics. And in the center, carved larger than the rest, was what looked like a plea or commandment. A sound made him turn. Ruth had found something in an alcove. A leather bundle, similar to the one he'd discovered in the archive chamber, but larger, more elaborate. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal pages covered in symbols. But these pages had something the others didn't: parallel text in a second writing system, one that looked almost familiar. Daniel rushed over, his hands shaking with excitement as he examined the pages. "Mr. Trent," Mackie said calmly, "seems we arrived just in time." Trent's face showed a flicker of surprise before smoothing back to confidence. "Sheriff, how convenient. These people were trespassing on my property." "Your property that you acquired through a fraudulent court order," Mackie interrupted. "Funny thing, I sent a telegram to the territorial governor this morning, questioning the legality of that deed reversal. Turns out the judge who signed it is under investigation for accepting bribes." His rulings for the past 6 months are all being reviewed. Elijah felt hope surge in his chest. Mackie continued, and I received a very interesting telegraph response an hour ago. The governor himself is riding here with federal marshals. Should arrive tomorrow. He's very interested in this cave system Mr. Stone discovered, especially after the detailed reports that a young clerk named Daniel Webb has been sending him for the past week. Daniel smiled slightly, and Elijah realized the young man had been more clever than any of them knew. Trent's expression darkened. This changes nothing. I have documentation. You have forged documentation, came another voice from the passage. An elderly man emerged, dressed in travel-stained clothes but with an air of authority. He was perhaps 70, with white hair and sharp eyes that took in everything. Mr. Trent, we meet at last. I'm Professor Edmund Whitmore. The name struck Elijah immediately, the surveyor who'd mapped this cave in 1847 and then disappeared. Trent's face went pale. That's impossible. Edmund Whitmore died 30 years ago. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, the old man said with a slight smile. Actually, I went into hiding after I realized what I'd found in this cave and what certain powerful people would do to control it. I've spent 3 decades waiting for the right moment, the right people, to help me protect it. He looked at Elijah. When I heard about an honest former scout who bought the Hoskins property and stood up to thugs and lawyers, I knew that moment had come. He pulled out papers, genuine aged documents. I have the original survey, the true territorial records showing this land was never properly available for purchase under the 1866 Land Act due to its archaeological significance. I also have sworn testimony about Mr. Trent's destruction of other sites, about bribery, about murder. I've been gathering evidence for years, waiting for him to make a move significant enough to bring him down. Trent's men were looking uncertain now, caught between their employer's orders and the reality of federal law enforcement closing in. Now, Whitmore said, Mr. Trent, you have a choice. You can cooperate with the territorial investigation, answer questions honestly, and face whatever legal consequences follow. Or you can resist, and I assure you, the governor has given Sheriff Mackie full authority to arrest you and anyone who aids you. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Trent laughed bitterly. 30 years. You've been planning this for 30 years. Not planning, Mr. Trent, protecting, waiting. The Anakira asked that their story be told truly, not exploited. I've made that my life's work. Slowly, Trent's men lowered their weapons. The scarred lieutenant stepped away from his employer, hands raised. We're hired help, Sheriff. Not interested in federal charges. Trent stood alone, his face a mask of rage and defeat. You can't protect this place forever. Someone will always want to control it. You're right, Elijah said, speaking up for the first time since Whitmore's arrival. Someone will always try. That's why it needs permanent protection, federal designation, and honest guardians. He looked at the legacy stone, at the chamber full of ancient wisdom. The Anakira trusted us, all of us, to make the right choice. I choose to honor that trust. Mackie moved forward with restraints. Marcus Trent, you're under arrest for bribery, conspiracy, trespassing, and attempted destruction of federally significant archaeological sites. You have the right to remain silent. As the sheriff took Trent into custody, Elijah turned to Whitmore. You've been protecting this place for 3 decades. The old man nodded. Samuel Hoskins was my friend. We found this chamber together in 1864, just before the Cordell gang arrived. We realized what it meant, what it would mean if the wrong people controlled it. Samuel stayed to guard it physically. I went to gather support, resources, legal protection. But by the time I returned, the gang had taken over the cave. Samuel had to pretend to be a mad hermit to keep watching over it. And when he died, Ruth asked, he sent word through channels we'd established. Asked me to find someone worthy to inherit the responsibility. Whitmore smiled at Elijah. Someone who would fight for truth rather than profit. His brother Hoskins knew to sell to someone with integrity. He chose well. Daniel was furiously taking notes. Professor, your original surveys, your research, this will revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian North America. That's the hope, young man. But it must be done right, carefully, with respect for what the Anakira left behind. He looked around the chamber. This isn't just an archaeological site. It's a sacred trust. They spent the next hour securing the chamber, documenting what they could before the governor's official team arrived. Trent was escorted out under guard, his men following meekly. As they prepared to leave themselves, Elijah stood before the legacy stone one final time. In his pocket was the translation Daniel had made, the message from a vanished people asking only to be remembered truly. He made a silent promise to the Anakira their story would be told. Not twisted, not exploited, but honored as they'd asked. Ruth touched his arm gently. You did it. You protected what needed protecting. We did it, Elijah corrected. All of us. Daniel's cleverness, your steadiness, Whitmore's patience, even Hoskins's sacrifice. The Anakira chose their guardians well. They emerged from the cave into late afternoon sunlight, and Elijah breathed deeply of the clean mountain air. In his hands, he carried copies of the translations, photographs of the carvings, and the weight of a trust that would define the rest of his life. But it was a weight he was proud to carry. Some treasures weren't meant to be found for personal gain. Some were meant to be protected, shared, and honored. The Anakira had waited 2,000 years to have their story told. Elijah would make sure it was told right. Stone, I think this is a translation key. Look, these symbols here appear on the walls, and next to them is this other script. It's not English, but it's closer to European writing than anything else we've found. Can you read it? Elijah asked. Some of it. Give me time. Daniel pulled out his notebook and began working frantically, copying symbols and comparing them. The sounds of men working on the door grew louder. Metal on stone. They were using tools to try to break through the locking mechanism. We need another way out, Ruth said practically. There has to be one. These chambers were built with intention. They wouldn't seal themselves into a single exit. Elijah looked around the vast chamber with new eyes. She was right. The ancient builders had been sophisticated engineers. They would have planned for multiple exits, for safety, for access. He began searching the perimeter, looking for signs of concealed passages. The stone cylinder had opened every door so far. Perhaps it would reveal more. He found it in a corner, behind a shelf of artifacts, faint seams in the stone, barely visible, forming the outline of a doorway. He inserted the cylinder into a slot beside it, aligned the symbols, and heard the familiar click of ancient mechanisms. The door slid aside, revealing a narrow passage ascending steeply upward. Found our exit, he called, but Daniel was still working on the translation, his eyes wide with what he was reading. Mr. Stone, you need to hear this. I've translated part of the Legacy Stone's message. The sounds from the main door grew even louder, the grinding of stone being levered apart. Make it quick, Elijah said. Daniel read from his notes, his voice urgent. To those who find this sacred place, we are the Anakira, the Star Watchers, the builders of the high places. We came to this land 2,000 years before your time, and we thrived for 500 generations. We studied the heavens, understood the earth, healed the sick, and built cities that touched the sky. But the world changed, and we could not change with it. The rains failed. The game vanished. The winters grew long. Our people scattered to survive, joining with other tribes. Our knowledge slowly forgotten, as survival became all that mattered. This chamber holds what we could not carry, our learning, our discoveries, our story. We leave it for those who come after with this single request. Tell our story truly. We existed. We learned. We created. Do not let us be forgotten. Daniel's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. And then there's a warning. Those who seek to hide or destroy this knowledge for their own gain will bear the burden of our loss. We leave guardians not of spirit but of truth. Your own conscience must be your guide. Use what you find here wisely, or the weight of our vanished civilization will haunt you forever. A tremendous crash came from the main door. They'd broken through part of it. We have to go, Ruth said, already gathering what she could carry. But Elijah stood frozen, looking at the legacy stone, understanding now what they'd found. This wasn't just an archaeological site. It was a trust, a responsibility handed down across millennia. The Anakira had entrusted their memory to whoever found this place, asking only that their truth be protected and shared, and Marcus Trent wanted to control or destroy it. "Take everything you can carry," Elijah commanded. "Daniel, bring your translations. Ruth, those samples. I'll take the legacy stone rubbing I've been making." They gathered their materials quickly. Behind them, more stone crashed. The door was giving way. But as they prepared to enter the escape passage, the main door finally burst open and men poured through. 5 of them led by Trent's scarred lieutenant, all carrying lanterns and guns. "Nobody move," the scarred man commanded, his pistol aimed at Elijah. "Step away from that passage." They froze. The man looked around the chamber, his eyes widening at what the lantern light revealed. "Well now," he said softly, "the boss is going to be very pleased." "Very pleased indeed. You can't take this," Daniel said desperately. "This belongs to history, to everyone," the man laughed. "Son, everything belongs to whoever has the power to take it. And Mr. Trent has plenty of power." A new voice came from behind the armed men, cultured and calm. "Actually, gentlemen, I think we can resolve this peacefully." A well-dressed man in his 50s stepped through the broken doorway. He wore an expensive suit somehow unstained by the cave's dirt, and his eyes were intelligent, calculating. Marcus Trent himself. He looked around the chamber with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Magnificent. Even better than I'd hoped." His gaze settled on Elijah. "Mr. Stone, I presume. The stubborn old scout who's caused me so much trouble." "This site is protected," Elijah said evenly. "It's on my property, and Sheriff Mackey has declared it off-limits pending territorial investigation." Trent smiled. "Your property? That's the amusing part. You see, while you've been playing archaeologist, my lawyers have been quite busy. The deed you hold is indeed invalid. A territorial judge ruled on it this morning. The land reverts to open territory, and I've already filed a new claim with proper documentation." He pulled papers from his jacket. "Signed, sealed, and legal. This cave is now mine." Elijah felt the world shift beneath him. All his planning, all his work, undone by legal maneuvering, he couldn't fight. "You can't," Ruth said. "The territory will investigate." "Federal authorities will find nothing," Trent interrupted, "because I'm going to document this site properly, through reputable archaeologists I employ, and publish findings that support my research. The world will know about the Anakira through my papers, my books, my museums." "You'll twist the truth," Daniel said. "You'll make it fit your theories instead of letting it speak for itself." "I'll make it useful," Trent corrected. "History is always about interpretation, young man. And the man who controls the evidence controls the interpretation." Elijah's mind raced. They were trapped, outgunned, and legally outmaneuvered. But something Trent had said bothered him. He wanted to publish, wanted credit. That meant he needed the site intact. "What about us?" Elijah asked. "You can't let us just walk away knowing what we know," Trent considered. "Actually, I can. You'll sign documents agreeing never to speak of this site or publish anything about it. In return, I won't press charges for trespassing and theft of artifacts. You'll leave Montana, of course. But you'll leave alive and free." It was a trap, Elijah knew. Trent would never let them leave as witnesses. The documents were just a pretense, a way to keep them compliant until they could be dealt with permanently. But Elijah played along, buying time. "And if we refuse?" Trent's expression hardened. "Then my men will make sure you have an unfortunate accident. Cave-ins are common in unstable systems like this. 3 bodies never found. Such a tragedy." That's when they heard it. Voices from above, from the escape passage Elijah had found. Multiple voices and one he recognized. Sheriff Mackey emerged from the passage, followed by 6 armed men, deputies and townspeople. The sheriff took in the scene quickly, his hand resting on his pistol. The territorial governor arrived the next morning with a contingent of federal marshals, 3 archaeologists from Eastern universities, and a determination to see justice done. Governor Harrison was a practical man in his 50s who'd built his reputation on incorruptibility. Exactly. The kind of official needed for a situation like this. He set up a temporary headquarters in Copper Ridge's largest building, the community hall, and began taking statements from everyone involved. Elijah spent 4 hours detailing everything he'd found, with Daniel corroborating the timeline and Ruth providing geological context. Professor Whitmore presented his decades of documentation, a mountain of evidence that painted a damning picture of Trent's activities throughout the territory. "This is extraordinary," Governor Harrison said, reviewing the photographs and translations Daniel had prepared. "If authenticated, this represents the most significant archaeological discovery in North American history." "It's authentic," Whitmore assured him. "I've spent 30 years verifying every detail. The Anakira civilization was real, advanced, and far older than any European presence on this continent." The governor nodded slowly. "Then we need to protect it. Federal protection, immediate designation as a restricted archaeological site, and a proper scientific investigation." He looked at Elijah. "Mr. Stone, I understand you own the property where this cave is located, or at least your claim is more legitimate than Trent's fraudulent one." "I bought it fair and square from Hoskins," Elijah confirmed. $500 properly recorded. The Territorial Land Office has verified your deed as valid. The reversal issued by the corrupt judge has been nullified." Harrison paused. "However, given the significance of what you've found, the federal government will need to acquire this land for proper stewardship. We'll pay you fair market value, considerably more than $500, I assure you." Elijah had expected this. "I have a counteroffer, Governor." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "Designate it as a federal protected site, yes. Bring in your archaeologists and scientists, absolutely. But let me stay on as the official guardian and caretaker. I'll deed the land to the government for $1 in exchange for a lifetime appointment protecting what's in that cave." He glanced at Whitmore. "The professor here has shown me what guardianship means. I'd like to continue that work." The old professor smiled approvingly. Governor Harrison considered. "That's an unusual request, but given your role in protecting the site from Trent and Professor Whitmore's endorsement, I'm inclined to agree. You'd work with the scientific teams, provide security, and ensure the site is treated with appropriate respect." "That's exactly what I'd do." "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Stone. I'll have the papers drawn up. Over the next week, Copper Ridge transformed into a hub of activity. Archaeologists arrived with equipment, establishing a proper camp near the cave entrance. The federal marshals completed their investigation of Trent, gathering enough evidence to ensure he'd spend years in prison. And teams began the careful, methodical work of documenting everything in the cave system. Elijah found himself in an unexpected role, part guide, part guardian, part liaison between the scientists and the site itself. He led teams through the passages he'd mapped, showed them the chambers he'd discovered, and shared everything he'd learned. But he also set boundaries, insisting that the site be treated with reverence, that artifacts be documented in place before removal, that the Anakira's legacy be honored. Daniel was hired as an official assistant to the archaeological team, his knowledge of the site and his translation work making him invaluable. The young man thrived in the role, his enthusiasm tempered by growing understanding of the responsibility they all carried. Ruth provided logistical support, feeding the teams and managing supplies. But more than that, she'd become Elijah's partner in the guardianship, sharing his determination to protect what they'd found. Their friendship had deepened into something more, though neither had spoken of it directly yet. Professor Whitmore served as the project's senior advisor, his decades of research finally vindicated. He spent hours with the younger archaeologists, teaching them not just about the Anakira, but about the ethics of archaeology, the importance of protecting sites from exploitation. One evening, a week into the official investigation, Elijah and Whitmore stood at the cave entrance, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "You've done well," Whitmore said quietly. "The Anakira would approve of you. I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing right by them. bringing all these people in, disturbing what they meant to preserve. They wanted their story told, Whitmore reminded him, but told truly, with respect. That's what you're ensuring. Every decision you make, you ask yourself, would this honor them? That's the right instinct. Elijah nodded. Samuel Hoskins, your friend. What was he like? Whitmore's eyes grew distant with memory. He was like you, actually. Honest, determined, willing to sacrifice for something larger than himself. When we first discovered the deep chambers together back in 1864, he immediately understood their importance. While I went to try to secure official protection, he stayed to guard them. Lived out here alone for years, letting people think him mad to keep them away from the cave. That's a hard sacrifice. It was. But he never regretted it. The last letter I received from him just before he died, he said he'd lived a life of purpose. That's more than most men can claim. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day end. Then Whitmore spoke again. There's something you should know, Elijah. Something Samuel found in the deepest chamber. Something I didn't mention to the governor yet. Elijah turned to him, alert. The heart chamber isn't the deepest point of the cave system. There's another level below it, sealed by mechanisms even more complex than what you've encountered. Samuel only discovered it in his final year, and he never managed to open it. He believed it held the Anakira's most precious knowledge, perhaps the reason they chose this specific location for their archive. Why didn't you mention this to the official investigation? Because I'm not certain it should be opened, Whitmore said honestly. The Anakira sealed it for a reason. They were sophisticated people. If they chose to lock something away that completely, perhaps we should respect that choice. Elijah thought about this, but the curiosity will eat at us. At me, certainly. Knowing there's more to discover, more to learn. Yes, and that's the test of a true guardian, knowing when to pursue knowledge and when to let mysteries remain mysteries. Whitmore looked at him seriously. I'm old, Elijah. I won't be around much longer. This decision will fall to you eventually. I wanted you to know about it, to think about it, before that time comes. The weight of that responsibility settled on Elijah's shoulders. He'd thought protecting the site meant keeping people like Trent away. He hadn't considered that it might also mean protecting the site from his own curiosity, his own desire to know everything. How do you decide something like that? He asked. You don't, not alone. You talk to people you trust, people who understand the stakes. You consider what the Anahira would want, and then you make the best choice you can, knowing you might be wrong, but doing your best to be right. That night, Elijah lay awake in his room at Ruth's boarding house, his permanent home now, thinking about sealed chambers and the burden of guardianship. Sarah would have understood this dilemma. She'd always believed some things were worth pursuing and some things were worth protecting, and wisdom lay in knowing which was which. The next morning, one of the archaeologists, a Dr. Catherine Reynolds from Boston, made an exciting announcement at the daily briefing. She'd successfully translated large portions of the Anakira texts using Daniel's initial work and Whitmore's research. The Anakira weren't just an isolated culture, she explained, her voice vibrant with excitement. They had contact with civilizations across vast distances. There are references in their texts to peoples living thousands of miles away, trade networks that spanned the continent, knowledge shared across cultures we thought never interacted. This challenges everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian America, another archaeologist added. Exactly. Dr. Reynolds continued. And there's more. Their astronomical knowledge suggests they understood concepts we're only now beginning to grasp. Celestial mechanics, the relationship between lunar cycles and tides, possibly even the basic principles of what we call physics. Daniel had been listening intently. Dr. Reynolds, did you find any references in the texts to sealed chambers, to knowledge deliberately locked away? The archaeologist consulted her notes. There are oblique references to the deep teaching, knowledge reserved for those who demonstrated wisdom as well as intelligence. But nothing specific about location or access. Elijah caught Whitmore's eye across the room. The old professor gave a slight nod. The choice about the sealed chamber below the heart chamber would indeed fall to them. That afternoon, Sheriff Mackey arrived with news. Trent's trial date is set, 3 months from now in Denver. The prosecution wants you all to testify. You, Daniel, Ruth, and the professor. We'll be there, Elijah assured him. Mackey hesitated. There's something else. We searched Trent's Denver office and found documents, journals, really. Seems he's been obsessed with sites like this for nearly 2 decades. He believes there's something in the Anakira knowledge that would prove his theories about ancient advanced civilizations. His theories weren't entirely wrong, Whitmore observed. The Anakira were advanced, but he wanted to control the narrative, Mackey continued. His journals talk about finding the ultimate proof, something that would make his name as the greatest archaeologist of the age. He believed this site held that proof. Did he say what specifically he was looking for? Elijah asked, feeling a chill of premonition. Mackey pulled out a paper. He'd acquired fragments of text from other sites he'd destroyed, partial references to something called the Deep Teaching. He believed it was a cache of advanced technical knowledge, possibly even things like metallurgy or engineering beyond current capabilities. Elijah and Whitmore exchanged glances again. There's no evidence of such a cache in the chambers we've explored, Dr. Reynolds said. Everything we've found is consistent with an advanced pre-Columbian culture, but nothing beyond the realm of human achievement for the era. Maybe that's all there is, Daniel suggested. Maybe Trent was chasing a fantasy, but Elijah knew better. He could feel it. There was more to discover, deeper secrets to uncover. The question was whether those secrets should remain hidden. The official investigation continued for another week. Teams carefully catalogued artifacts, photographed every carving, documented every chamber. The work was painstaking, respectful, exactly what Elijah had hoped for. Ruth found him one evening as he stood watch at the cave entrance, making sure no unauthorized visitors tried to enter. You've been quiet lately, she said. Standing beside him. Been thinking about? He told her about the sealed chamber below, about Whitmore's revelation and Trent's obsessive searching. There's more down there, Ruth, more than what we've found. And I don't know if we should go looking for it. She was quiet for a moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. My husband used to say that not every mountain needs to be climbed. Sometimes the value is in knowing it's there, in respecting it enough to leave it alone. But what if what's down there could help people? What if it's medical knowledge or engineering that could improve lives? And what if it's knowledge that we're not ready for? What if the Anakira sealed it away because they knew some things do more harm than good in the wrong hands or at the wrong time? She turned to him. You've protected this site from men like Trent. Maybe protecting it also means protecting it from well-intentioned curiosity. Her words resonated deeply. But Elijah still felt torn. That night he had a dream. He was standing in the heart chamber, and the legacy stone was glowing with soft light. In the dream, he could read the symbols, could understand what the Anakira were saying. They were telling him about balance, about how knowledge and wisdom must grow together, how advancing one without the other led to destruction. They showed him images of their own civilization's mistakes, times when they'd developed capabilities faster than the wisdom to use them properly. They showed him why they'd eventually sealed away certain knowledge, waiting for a future generation that might be ready for it. When he woke, the dream stayed vivid in his mind, and he knew what had to be done. He found Whitmore at breakfast and asked for a private conversation. They walked to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. I've decided, Elijah said. The sealed chamber stays sealed. For now, at least. Maybe forever. Whitmore looked relieved. You're certain? The Anakira were wise people. If they chose to lock something away, they had good reason. We're still learning to respect what they left open. Until we've fully understood and properly honored that, we have no business trying to uncover what they deliberately hid. A wise decision. I'm glad to know the guardianship will be in good hands. They stood together in comfortable silence. Then Whitmore said, There's one more thing I need to tell you. My health isn't what it was. The doctors give me perhaps a year, maybe less. Elijah felt a pang of sorrow. I'm sorry, don't be. I've had a full life, a purposeful one. I've seen this site protected, seen the Anakira's story beginning to be told properly. That's enough. He put a hand on Elijah's shoulder. But I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, keep making the hard choices. Keep being the guardian this place needs. And train someone to follow you, someone like Daniel, who has both intelligence and integrity, I promise. Good. Now, let's go back. Dr. Reynolds wants to show us something she found in the translations, something beautiful. The discovery Dr. Reynolds wanted to share was indeed beautiful. She'd translated a section of the Chronicle walls that contained Anakira poetry, verses about the mountains, the stars, the interconnection of all living things. It was profound and moving, demonstrating that the Anakira weren't just scientists and engineers, but artists and philosophers. They were fully human, Dr. Reynolds said, her voice soft with emotion. They loved, created, wondered, and questioned just as we do. This isn't just about their technical achievements. It's about recognizing our connection to them across the centuries. That night, the entire team gathered for a meal Ruth had prepared. Archaeologists, marshals, Daniel, Whitmore, Sheriff Mackey, and Elijah sat together, sharing food and conversation. They toasted the Anakira, thanked one another for their work, and celebrated the protection of something precious. As the evening wound down and people drifted away to their tents and rooms, Elijah found himself alone with Ruth under the vast Montana sky. "You've found your purpose here, haven't you?" she asked. "I have. For the first time since Sarah died, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, doing what I'm supposed to do." "Your Sarah would be proud." "She would." He took a breath, gathering courage. "Ruth, I know it hasn't been long since we met, and I know neither of us is young anymore. But Elijah Stone," she interrupted gently, "are you trying to ask me something?" He smiled. "I suppose I am. I'm going to be here guarding this site for the rest of my life. It's not an easy life and it's not a wealthy one, but it's a life with meaning. And I'd like to share it with someone who understands that meaning. Are you proposing to me? Eventually, if you'll have me. But right now, I'm just asking if you'd consider staying, working with me here, being partners in this guardianship." Ruth smiled, and in the starlight she looked younger, happier. "Elijah Stone, I thought you'd never ask. Yes, to all of it, the partnership, the guardianship, and eventually, when you work up the nerve to ask properly, the marriage too." They stood together, looking up at the same stars the Anakira had studied centuries ago, feeling the weight and joy of purpose, of connection, of new beginnings built on ancient foundations. The cave was protected. The story would be told, and Elijah had found not just a purpose, but a companion to share it with. Everything was falling into place, as if the Anakira themselves were guiding events from across the centuries, ensuring their legacy would be in good hands. They returned to find Copper Ridge transformed by their success. News of the trial had spread, and the town had embraced its new identity as home to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history. The boarding house's dining room had been converted into a makeshift museum, displaying photographs and reproductions of Anakira artifacts. Visitors were already arriving, scholars, journalists, curious citizens, all wanting to learn about the ancient civilization. Sheriff Mackey met them at the coach station. "Welcome back, heroes!" Town's been buzzing. "Mayor wants to rename Main Street after Professor Whitmore." The old professor laughed. "I'd prefer they didn't, but I appreciate the sentiment. There's been some trouble, too," Mackey continued, his expression growing serious. 3 men tried to sneak onto the property 2 nights ago. We caught them before they reached the cave, but they claimed they had permission from the true owner. When we pressed them, they mentioned someone named Garrison." Elijah felt ice in his veins. "Wade Garrison?" "That's what they said." "Mean anything to you?" It meant everything. Wade Garrison was the Cordell gang member who'd gone deepest into the cave, who'd supposedly died there, but whose body had never been found. If someone was claiming to represent Garrison now, decades later, it opened disturbing possibilities. Back at the property, Elijah found evidence of the attempted intrusion. The men had been well equipped with modern mining tools, suggesting they'd planned to break through sealed passages. They'd also left behind a note, weighted down with a rock near the cave entrance. The handwriting was shaky but legible. The deep teaching belongs to those brave enough to claim it. You protect cowards' fears, not wisdom. The true heir will come. True heir? Daniel read over Elijah's shoulder. What does that mean? Professor Whitmore took the note, studying it with concern. Wade Garrison supposedly had a son. I came across references to him years ago. A boy named Jacob, maybe 8 or 9 years old, when his father disappeared into this cave. If Jacob survived, he'd be in his late 40s now, and he might blame the cave for his father's death, Ruth said, or believe his father found something that rightfully belongs to him. Elijah felt the situation crystallizing. They'd dealt with Trent's greed, but now they faced something potentially more dangerous, a man with a personal claim. Driven not by profit but by legacy and loss. We need to find him before he tries again, Elijah said. And we need to understand what he thinks his father discovered. They questioned the 3 captured men who were being held in the town jail. 2 refused to talk, but the third, a younger man with nervous eyes, eventually broke under Sheriff Mackey's patient interrogation. Jacob Garrison hired us in Denver, he admitted. Said his father had died protecting the greatest discovery in American history, and greedy men were keeping it from him. He showed us letters, old papers his father had sent before disappearing. They talked about ancient knowledge, about things that would change the world. Where is Jacob Garrison now? Mackey asked. Don't know. He said he'd come himself when the time was right. Said he needed to prepare, to gather the right people. He's convinced that sealed chamber contains something his father died trying to protect, not from the world, but for his family. After the interrogation, Elijah gathered his core group, Daniel, Ruth, Whitmore, and Mackey in the boarding house's back room. Jacob Garrison believes his father was a hero, not an outlaw who died trying to steal ancient secrets, Elijah said. He's rewritten the story in his mind, made Wade into a martyr. That makes him dangerous because he thinks he's on a righteous mission. Do we know anything about him? Ruth asked. Whitmore pulled out notes from his decades of research. I investigated Wade Garrison's history years ago. His son Jacob was raised by an aunt after Wade disappeared. The boy grew up obsessed with his father's legend, collecting every scrap of information about the Cordell gang. He became an engineer, ironically, studied at Eastern universities, worked on mining operations. He has the knowledge and resources to be a serious threat. And if he believes that sealed chamber contains what his father died for, Daniel added, he won't stop until he opens it. Elijah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. The sealed chamber had been a theoretical concern before. Now it was an immediate problem. Garrison would come, would try to breach it, and Elijah would have to decide how far he was willing to go to keep it sealed. We need to be ready, he said finally. Not just ready to stop him, but ready to face the possibility that he might be right, that there's something down there his father discovered, something that changes everything. You're not considering opening it? Whitmore asked, his voice sharp with concern. I'm considering that we might not have a choice. If Garrison's coming with engineers and equipment, he might break through regardless of what we do. Better we control the opening than let him blast his way in. The room fell silent as everyone processed this. That's a significant shift from your previous position, Dr. Reynolds said. She joined them at Elijah's request, her expertise potentially crucial. What changed? Reality changed, Elijah said. I wanted to respect the Anakira's decision to seal that chamber. But if someone's going to open it anyway, violently and without proper precautions, then maybe the respectful thing is to open it carefully, properly, with the right people present. Ruth spoke up. Or maybe the respectful thing is to defend it at all costs. The Anakira sealed it. They had reasons. Maybe those reasons are more important than our curiosity or Garrison's obsession. It was the fundamental question, and Elijah didn't have an answer. That night, Elijah descended alone into the cave, needing to think in the presence of what he was trying to protect. He made his way to the heart chamber, to the chronicle walls, where the Anakira's complete history was recorded. He stood before the legacy stone, the final message from a vanished people, and spoke aloud to them, as if they could hear. "I don't know what to do. You trusted us to protect your legacy, but I don't know if protecting it means keeping everything sealed or ensuring it's opened properly. Help me understand, please." The stone, of course, didn't answer. But as Elijah studied the carvings by lantern light, something caught his eye that he'd missed before. Near the bottom of the legacy stone, almost hidden in the decorative border, was a small carving, different from the rest, a symbol that matched ones he'd seen on the stone cylinder, the key to the sealed passages. He pulled out the cylinder from his pack and examined it closely. There, among the geometric patterns, was a sequence he hadn't noticed before. And suddenly he understood. The legacy stone wasn't just a message. It was also a test and a guide. The Anakira had left instructions, hidden in plain sight, for those who proved themselves worthy guardians. His hands trembling slightly, Elijah traced the pattern on the stone, then looked at the sealed doorway that led to the deepest chamber. The stone cylinder would open it. He knew that now. The Anakira had designed it so that anyone who took the time to truly understand their culture, to study the legacy stone with care and respect, would find the key. They'd sealed the deepest chamber, yes, but they'd also left a way to open it for those who approached with the right intentions. The question remained, did Elijah have those intentions? Was he ready for what might be inside? He made his decision. Returning to the surface, he found his companions waiting anxiously. "I know how to open the sealed chamber," he announced. The Anakira left instructions hidden in the legacy stone. They wanted it sealed, but not forever. They wanted it opened by people who'd proven themselves by understanding their culture first. "So we open it," Daniel said, excitement in his voice. "We open it," Elijah confirmed. "But we do it right. With proper documentation, with Dr. Reynolds and other experts present, and before Jacob Garrison forces his way in and potentially destroys everything." Whitmore looked troubled but nodded. "If that's your decision as guardian, I'll support it. But Elijah, once we open that chamber, we can't unsee what's inside. Make certain you're ready for that." "I'm not certain of anything," Elijah admitted. "But I'm certain that hiding from knowledge isn't what the Anakira wanted. They wanted wisdom to guide knowledge, and I think we've proven we have at least some wisdom." They spent the next day preparing. Dr. Reynolds brought in 2 additional archaeologists she trusted. Sheriff Mackey arranged for armed guards to secure the site. They gathered photography equipment, documentation tools, and safety gear. As evening approached, the team assembled at the cave entrance. 10 people in total, each chosen for their integrity and expertise. They would descend together, open the sealed chamber together, and face whatever lay within together. Elijah led them down through the passages, through the bone chamber where outlaws had died, down the carved stairs, through the archive and chronicle wall chambers, to the sealed door. He explained what he'd discovered on the legacy stone, showed them the sequence on the stone cylinder. "Once I do this, there's no going back," he said. "Everyone ready?" They nodded, lanterns held high, faces serious with the weight of the moment. Elijah inserted the stone cylinder into the first position and began the sequence. Each alignment produced a satisfying click as ancient mechanisms engaged. The Anakira's engineering was still perfect after centuries. The final position. Elijah turned the cylinder, and they heard the deep grinding of stone on stone. The sealed door began to open, revealing darkness beyond that their lanterns couldn't quite penetrate. Whatever the Anakira had hidden in the deepest part of their archive, whatever Wade Garrison had died seeking, whatever Jacob Garrison believed was his birthright, they were about to discover it, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The chamber beyond the sealed door was smaller. than Elijah had expected, intimate rather than grand, perhaps 30 feet across. But what it contained took his breath away. The walls were carved with what appeared to be teaching texts, step-by-step instructions illustrated with precise diagrams. Dr. Reynolds moved closer with her lantern, studying them with growing amazement. "These are technical manuals," she breathed. "Agricultural techniques for maximizing yield in difficult climates. Astronomical calculations for navigation. Medical procedures showing surgical techniques centuries ahead of their time. Architectural principles for earthquake-resistant buildings. They've left us a complete education, but it was what sat in the center of the chamber that drew everyone's attention." On a raised platform was a series of carved stone tablets arranged in careful order, and beside them, preserved in sealed vessels made of some material none of them recognized, were scrolls that appeared impossibly intact. Elijah approached carefully, aware he was treading on something sacred. The first tablet bore writing they could read, the same translation system Daniel had discovered earlier. It was a direct message, clearly intended as an introduction to everything else in the room. Daniel read it aloud, his voice reverent. "To those who open this chamber, you have proven yourselves worthy by taking the time to understand rather than simply take. The knowledge we preserve here is powerful. It can heal or harm, build or destroy, depending on the wisdom of those who use it. We seal it not to hide it forever, but to ensure it passes only to those who approach with respect and patience. If you have opened this door, you have demonstrated those qualities. Use what you find here to benefit all people, not to raise some above others. Share it freely, but share it thoughtfully. Let wisdom guide knowledge always. We are the Anakira. We lived, we learned, we loved, we disappeared. But through you, through what we leave behind, we continue. Tell our story. Honor our trust. Build a better world than the one we could not save. This is our gift to the future. Use it well." Silence filled the chamber as the words settled over them. This wasn't just archaeological discovery. It was inheritance, responsibility, sacred trust. Dr. Reynolds was already examining the teaching texts with tears in her eyes. "Do you understand what this is? This is a complete civilization's knowledge, organized for teaching. Agriculture, medicine, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, all preserved and explained. This could help millions of people, but it has to be shared properly," Whitmore said, his old voice firm. "Not hoarded, not weaponized, not sold to the highest bidder." This is what the Anakira feared, that their knowledge would be used for power rather than benefit. "Then we make certain that doesn't happen," Elijah said. "We document everything here, make it available to universities and institutions worldwide. We publish it, share it, make it impossible for anyone to control." They spent hours in that chamber, carefully photographing everything, making initial translations, cataloging the contents. The knowledge was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The Anakira had understood crop rotation, irrigation systems, medicinal properties of plants, the human circulatory system, mathematical principles, astronomical movements, all explained with clarity and precision. "This is going to take years to fully translate and understand," Dr. Reynolds said. "But even the preliminary work will revolutionize multiple fields. Agriculture alone. The techniques described here could help feed populations in harsh climates worldwide." As they worked, Elijah noticed something else, evidence that Wade Garrison had indeed reached this chamber. In a corner, partially hidden, was a leather satchel similar to the one Blackjack Cordell had left in the upper cave. Inside were papers covered in Wade's handwriting, notes he'd made about what he'd found, translations he'd attempted. The final entry was haunting. "I've found it. The teaching the old ones left behind. Knowledge that could make me the richest, most powerful man alive. But the more I read, the more I understand why they sealed it away. This knowledge in the wrong hands, my hands, if I'm honest, would be dangerous. I came here for gold and found something worth far more and far more dangerous. I'm dying. The air down here, or disease, or maybe just the weight of understanding what I found and what I almost did with it. I'll die in this chamber, And maybe that's right. The teaching shouldn't leave until someone worthy finds it. Someone better than me. To whoever reads this, I was a thief and a killer. But even I can see that some treasures are bigger than one man's greed. Protect this. Share it right, or don't share it at all. Wade Garrison, November 1864. Elijah read the note aloud to the others. Even in death, Wade Garrison had become a guardian of sorts. Recognizing at the end that some things were more important than personal gain, they sealed the chamber again that night, but with full documentation of its contents and plans for proper scholarly access. As they ascended back to the surface, exhausted but exhilarated, they knew they'd crossed a threshold. The Anakira's complete legacy was now known, ready to be shared with the world. But when they emerged, they found Jacob Garrison waiting. He was a man in his late 40s, weathered and strong, with his father's eyes and his father's determination. He stood near the cave entrance with Sheriff Mackey, having turned himself in voluntarily. "I heard you went down," Jacob said, looking at Elijah. "Did you find it? Did you find what my father died for?" Elijah approached him carefully. "We found the deepest chamber, yes, and we found your father's final words. He wasn't the villain you might have feared, Mr. Garrison. At the end, he understood the importance of what he'd discovered. He protected it. He died down there because of that cave," Jacob said, his voice rough with old pain. "He died down there protecting knowledge that could help millions of people," Elijah corrected gently. "He died having become something better than what he'd been. That's something to honor, not avenge." He handed Jacob the leather satchel with Wade's final note. The man read it with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I spent my whole life angry at that cave, at whoever had kept me from my father's discovery. I thought they'd stolen his legacy." He looked up at Elijah. "But his legacy was choosing to protect something rather than exploit it. That's what I should have understood." "It's not too late," Ruth said kindly. "The knowledge is being shared now properly. Your father's choice made that possible. You could be part of honoring that choice." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'd like that. I'd like to help if you'll have me." In the weeks that followed, the story of the Anakira spread worldwide. Publications from Boston to London ran articles about the ancient civilization and their preserved knowledge. Universities sent scholars to study the site. The agricultural techniques were being tested in farms across difficult climates. Medical researchers were examining the Anakira's understanding of healing. And through it all, Elijah, Ruth, Danielle, Professor Whitmore, and now Jacob Garrison served as guardians, ensuring the knowledge was shared freely but responsibly. The territorial government, with federal support, established the site as the Anakira Historical Preserve, with Elijah as its first official director. The position came with a small salary, housing, and the authority to control access to the caves. 6 months after opening the sealed chamber, Elijah and Ruth were married in a small ceremony near the cave entrance. Professor Whitmore officiated, Daniel served as witness, and even Sheriff Mackey attended with most of the town. They were building a life together based on shared purpose and deep respect. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in gold and red, Elijah stood at the cave entrance watching the sunset. Ruth joined him, slipping her hand into his. "No regrets?" she asked. "About what?" "About spending $500 on what everyone said was worthless land. About choosing to protect rather than profit. About dedicating your life to guarding something most people will never see." Elijah smiled, pulling her close. "Not one regret. I came west looking for something. I didn't know what. Turned out I was looking for purpose, for meaning, for a way to honor Sarah's memory by fighting for truth worth protecting. And you found all that in an empty cave? Found it in a cave full of knowledge and responsibility. Found it in friends who became family. Found it in you." He kissed her forehead gently. "That $500 bought me a new life, Ruth. Bought us both new lives. They stood together as darkness fell and stars emerged. The same stars the Anakira had studied centuries ago. Inside the cave, ancient knowledge waited to be slowly, carefully shared with the world. Outside, the guardian who'd protected it stood watch with his partner. His purpose clear, his heart at peace. The old man who'd sold him the land had been right about one thing: the cave wasn't empty. But he'd been wrong about what filled it. It wasn't gold or bones or wind. It was legacy, responsibility, and the trust of a vanished people who'd believed in the future enough to leave their knowledge behind. Elijah had accepted that trust, had protected it from those who would corrupt it, and had opened it to those ready to receive it properly. That was his purpose now for the rest of his days, and he'd never been more certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be.